Ever feel like history is kind of like frozen in time, like everything's set in stone? Well, get ready to hit the unfreeze button, because today we're diving into a text that seriously shakes things up when it comes to the Holy Land. Buckle up, because this one's a wild ride. We're looking at excerpts from pasted text, and let me tell you, the author doesn't hold back.
Oh, is that the one where they're claiming Jordan is the real promised land?
That's the one. They go all in, saying forget what you thought about modern-day Israel and Palestine.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement right off the bat.
Right, and they back it up with all this linguistic analysis of place names from the Torah and Quran. It's like they're saying the evidence has been hidden in plain sight, right there in the words themselves.
Interesting. So how do they even start to make that kind of argument?
Well, they dive deep into the language, breaking down these ancient place names and comparing them to locations in modern-day Jordan. They even suggest that Arabic could be the root language of these texts.
Huh. So they're really challenging the traditional understanding of where these stories originated.
Oh, absolutely. They even call out what they see as a deliberate misinterpretation of history by, and I'm quoting here, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Arabic priesthood of Israel. They don't mince words, that's for sure.
Wow, they really went there. So we've got some strong opinions and bold claims. To help us unpack all of this, I'm really glad to have you here as an expert in religious history and textual analysis. This text is dense, so I think the best place to start is by going back to the beginning. This idea that the Promised Land is actually in Jordan. What are your thoughts on that, just from a purely historical perspective? You're right, the author's claim is certainly a bold one. I mean, for centuries, the location of the Promised Land has been pretty much accepted. You know, it's been interpreted in a very specific way. But this author isn't just questioning those interpretations. It's more like they're saying, nope, completely wrong. That's going to ruffle some feathers for sure.
Totally. And they don't just throw out this huge claim without any backing. They get really specific, even giving examples. Like they talk about a place in the Torah that's often translated as Mount Hor, and they suggest its original Arabic meaning actually points to a mountain range in Jordan, not the one everyone usually associates with that story. And they do this with several locations, building this whole alternate map of the Holy Land. It's pretty mind-blowing. What do you make of that kind of linguistic analysis?
It's definitely interesting. You know how language changes over time? Words shift their meanings. It's like they're suggesting that's what happened here with these ancient place names somewhere along the line. The original meanings, the true meanings, got lost in translation, so to speak.
And this is where it gets even wilder. They don't just stick to the Torah. They pull in the Quran, too, highlighting passages that describe biblical events and locations that, according to them, line up with this Jordan-centric map. Have you ever seen anyone use multiple religious texts like this in historical analysis before?
I mean, it's not totally unheard of, but it's definitely not the usual approach. They're really diving into some deep waters here, suggesting these texts have this interconnectedness, this shared history that really challenges those traditional boundaries.
So it's like they're saying you can't truly understand one without considering the other. Like they're intertwined in ways we might not have even considered before. Which, now that you mentioned boundaries, leads me to something you touched on earlier, this whole idea that the traditional interpretation of the Holy Land was intentional. A deliberate misinterpretation.
Yes.
What could possibly be the motivation behind that? Why go through all the trouble of hiding the true Holy Land, if that's even what happened?
Right. Well, if you believe the author, it all boils down to power. They seem to think certain groups, the ones they call the, the priesthood, that they benefit from keeping up this whole charade, this supposed falsehood about the Holy Land.
So by controlling the narrative about where this all went down, they get to control what? History itself. That's a pretty hefty accusation, saying these groups are behind this massive cover-up.
It is. But to play devil's advocate for a second, they're not the first to suggest history is written by the winner, right? I mean, look, throughout history, different groups have always twisted events to fit their own agendas, so it's not totally out there to think maybe, just maybe, the story of the Holy Land got, molded and reshaped along the way, too.
Which makes you wonder, like, what is? What if this whole Jordan idea, this alternate Holy Land, what if it had caught on? Would we even be having this conversation right now?
It's definitely food for thought. Though the author seems to think acknowledging Jordan as the true Holy Land would somehow magically solve, like, centuries of conflict, which, come on.
Right, like changing a label on a map suddenly makes everything better.
Yeah, it's a little too good to be true, isn't it? And history has shown us time and time again that it's just not that simple. Conflicts, especially ones as old and complicated as those in that part of the world, There's so much more to it than just geography. It's about identity, resources, generations of, well, everything.
Generations of baggage, you could say.
Exactly. But even if the author's theory doesn't magically fix everything, it does make you think, what if things had gone differently? What if this Jordan-centric view had become the dominant one all those centuries ago? Would we even be having the same arguments today?
Now, those are some seriously mind-bending questions. It's like trying to imagine a whole alternate reality, all stemming from this one seemingly small thing, the location of the Holy Land.
It really highlights how even something we think of as a concrete fact, like where a historical event happened, can be open to interpretation. Makes you wonder what other truths we take for granted might be challenged or reinterpreted down the road, you know?
Absolutely. Which, speaking of challenging what we thought we knew, brings us to, well, this is where the author really throws us for a loop. They draw this really unexpected parallel between the Jewish practice of tefillin and, get this, the Kaaba in Islam.
Oh, right.
That one really threw me. Can you kind of walk us through it? I'll admit, I'm a little lost on that one.
Of course. So remember how we talked about the author really digging into those textual clues? Well, here, they're zeroing in on these two rituals, two very distinct but also very important religious practices. And they see this, almost like a symbolic link between how tefillin are worn on the head and arm and the physical structure of the Kaaba itself.
Okay, I'm going to need a little help with this one. For those of us who might not be as familiar, can you give us a quick refresher on both of those?
Absolutely. So tefillin are those small leather boxes, right, containing verses from the Torah, traditionally worn by Jewish men during morning prayers. It's a deeply symbolic practice, right? It represents this physical and spiritual connection to God.
Like a physical manifestation of their devotion.
Exactly. Now, the Kaaba, that's the cube-shaped structure in Mecca that Muslims circle during Hajj, considered the holiest site in Islam.
Okay, so we have these two very distinct practices, each central to their respective religions. But what's the author saying about the connection between them?
They're focusing on that physicality, those rituals. They see it as evidence of this deeper connection, this sort of hidden link between these two traditions. They even go so far as to say that the tefillin ritual, the way it emphasizes the head and arm, could actually be a symbolic representation of the Kaaba.
Wait, hold on. They're saying this Jewish practice is somehow referencing Islam's holiest site. That's a pretty out there claim. Have other scholars picked up on this connection before?
So it's important to say that this specific tefillin Kaaba connection is, well, pretty unique to this author. It hasn't really gained any traction in more, shall we say, mainstream scholarship. But that doesn't mean it's completely off base.
Right. Just because it sounds a little out there doesn't mean it's wrong.
Right. Could just be a new way of looking at things. It just means it needs more, more exploration.
Or digging, more deep dives.
Exactly. And that's what I find so interesting about this whole thing. It forces you to really confront your assumptions, to consider possibilities that you might not have even entertained before, even if they seem a little far-fetched at first.
So even if this whole tefillin Kaaba thing turns out to be a bit of a stretch, just the act of considering it opens up all these new avenues of thought. Makes you wonder what other connections might be out there, just waiting to be discovered, right?
Precisely. It reminds us that history and religion, it's not static. Our understanding is constantly evolving. There's always more to learn, new links to be made, and maybe even a few more surprises down the line.
It's like opening a window and letting in some fresh air. Suddenly we're seeing things with fresh eyes, even if it's a little disorienting at first.
Exactly. And sometimes those fresh eyes can reveal things that we just weren't seeing before.
Now, speaking of revealing new things, we've been laser focused on these very specific claims about the Holy Land, the linguistics, the whole cover-up theory, even this unexpected tefillin Kaaba connection. But we haven't really touched on why the author felt the need to present this alternative view in the first place. What's the bigger picture here?
Good question.
Like, so what? We've uncovered all this stuff, but what's the author really trying to get across?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
I think at the heart of it, they're trying to, shake things up a bit, make us question what we think we know about history, about how it's told. It's less about definitively proving that Jordan is the real Holy Land and more about showing us how interpretations of the past, they can be flexible, contested even.
So it's not just about the where, but the why behind these different interpretations. It's like they're saying, hey, don't just blindly accept what you've been told.
Right.
dig a little deeper, ask some questions. Who knows? Maybe things aren't as straightforward as they seem.
Exactly. And I think that's where the real value of this text lies, even if you don't necessarily agree with everything or anything, the author says. It forces us to confront those biases we all have, to accept that history isn't always black and white. There might be more than one way to understand what happened in the past.
It's like we all see the world through these lenses we don't even realize we have.
Yeah.
Shaped by our experiences, our beliefs, the stories we've been told. And sometimes it takes running into a totally different perspective, like this one, to make you realize just how much those lenses color your perception.
It's like taking one of those prisms, you know, holding it up to a beam of light, and suddenly what you thought was just a single beam, it explodes into this whole spectrum of colors. Suddenly there's all this complexity you never even knew existed.
It can be kind of exhilarating.
And
a little unsettling too, right?
Absolutely. It's like walking into one of those fun house mirror rooms. Everything's familiar, but also a little bit off.
A little warped.
Yes. And I think it's in those moments of, wait, what? That we really start to learn. That's when we start to question, to really open ourselves up to new ways of seeing things.
Embracing that sense of wonder.
Yeah.
Of, hold on a minute, what if?
Exactly. And that's what it's all about, isn't it? That constant questioning, that exploration, always trying to learn more, understand more about ourselves and the world around us.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. I mean, we really went there, obscure geographical locations, the very foundations of history, religious beliefs. It's a lot to process. As we wrap things up here, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
You know, if there's just one thing, it's this. Don't be afraid to question everything. Embrace the unknown. Even if you don't agree with this author, even if you think their ideas are totally out there, their willingness to challenge those conventional ways of thinking, that's something we can all learn from.
Beautifully said. And hey, sometimes those challenges lead to incredible discoveries, to connections and insights you never would have found otherwise. So next time you run into an idea that seems a little crazy, a little out there, don't write it off immediately. Dive in. You might be surprised what you find. And until then, keep asking those big questions, keep diving deep.